So I'm here with Samuel Bonder, and I just think I'll kick off by asking you a bit about your work, if that's okay, and what's the nature of the work that you do, and kind of why you do it.
Okay, the nature of the work. We help people enter into what you might call whole being integrity in themselves, in their activities, their relationships, their expression in the world. And you might define whole being integrity as something that's simultaneously in touch with and identified with the transcendent or the greater reality, as well as equally in touch with their own more apparently limited or finite reality.
Yes.
And why I do that work? Well, in my, I guess, it was my second year of college, having been, this is back in the late 60s, early 70s.
Right.
I had been very much involved in the anti-war movement, the Vietnam War, and other of the tumultuous things going on at that time, and my activism got eroded by the time I came back from my sophomore year of college by the recognition that pretty much everybody on every side of every issue was so ego-driven that it was as if we weren't seeing each other. We were like each inside a cage of mirrors, mostly noticing ourselves.
Right.
And I didn't read this anywhere. I was not yet studying ego transcendence in Eastern religions or anything like that. It just came upon me, but it was an overwhelmingly convicting insight. So I knew there was really no point in struggling to make what would wind up being relatively cosmetic changes. You know, what was going to be the difference if the student radicals got what they wanted? What was going to be the real difference if we did end the Vietnam War? I mean, I knew it was a good thing. It wasn't like I became opposed to it. But I had to find something other for myself. And that led to, I was born Jewish or raised Jewish, but not really with a strong religious core to it. And at this point, my feeling was, well, God, if you exist, help me out here, because I'm not going to be able to get out of this cage by myself. And that then led to a quest that fairly quickly things started happening that indicated, oh, there may very well be some greater power here. And I had various experiences, and my investigation led in different directions that eventually included both Eastern and Western sources. I spent many years with one very great, somewhat controversial Western-born teacher. Another of my key teachers was a fairly famous sage of India.
Yeah.
So there was a kind of a stream connecting the two of them in terms of a focus on the heart, we could say with a capital H, as not only the core of our human personal identity and integrity, but also using that language I just mentioned a little earlier, a whole being integrity that includes even an identification with the divine totality. So a mystical unity, intuitive unity. And my years of quest or search culminated in 1992, after I left my previous teacher, culminated in a great awakening that immediately communicated itself as, oh, this is what I've been looking for. And fairly quickly thereafter, it was as if another switch got flipped,
Yeah.
which is what in our work we call transmission. That essentially a capacity to radiate that condition to others in a way that they also notice. And that my friends began saying to me, some of them, something's going on with you. I know you've told me something's going on with you, but it's also affecting me, so how do we deal with that?
Huh.
And having studied in these schools of spirituality that essentially have been brought over from, many of them from the Eastern world, where even if the spiritual teachings and the states of awareness that are developed are themselves fairly advanced upon the usual state of mind and consciousness that people have, the politics and social culture of how these things are mediated has largely been transplanted from the old world. And for a lot of apparently good reasons in its day, this old world politics is essentially modeled around feudal or monarchic structures of society. And fairly quickly I was moved to present a teaching of a much more radical mutuality. That then led to, and communicated itself for me as an impulse to democratize all this. I had seen the effects of these approaches for a couple of decades of my own quest, where very few in any generation, in fact that's even the lore, very few in any generation will ultimately achieve awakening or enlightenment, self-realization, whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
And my feeling was, if I was able to move into this condition, given that I had left my long-time practice more or less in disgrace. I mean, I got up and walked out. Nobody threw me out, but the fact of leaving was not viewed as auspicious for one's further development. And that was when the process really kicked into gear for me.
Huh. Had you been doing that sort of as a full-time quest?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't have a life other than my quest.
Right.
I had a job. I worked as an editor and an educator and a priest in the specific spiritual community that I was in most of those years, nearly 20 years. But I was one of the people who didn't have another career outside that.
Got it.
I was married twice in that community, but I was pretty focused, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So when it became evident that I could help others move into a similar kind of condition, I became very motivated to democratize this awakened presence, which, again, part of the reason I use the phrase whole being integrity is because awakening, enlightenment, they're kind of buzzwords.
Yeah.
And in many ways what we're doing doesn't even fit very well among spiritual practices generally today. In a lot of ways it's significantly, I'll say at least distinctive.
Right.
But that's the motivation. It appears to me, and has now appeared to hundreds of other people who've gone through similar shifts, that this is a great gift of ourselves to ourselves and our capacity to be of the greatest service we can to others in the world. That's a generalization. Not everybody has the same motivations who goes through these kinds of shifts, but many of us do.
Yeah.
So that's a thumbnail sketch.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
When you said you had something going on with you and people started to notice around you that sort of like they had something going on with them, was that merely being in your presence?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
Yeah, we weren't.
You weren't sort of working directly?
I wasn't, yeah, I wasn't you know, they were friends.
Yeah.
So, and we were all spiritually inclined, so we,
Yes.
you know, I was sharing what was going on with me, I was talking about it. But several people began to notice that the proximity seemed to activate things in them, and having been involved with the kinds of teachers and teachings and traditions that I had, I understood very clearly that advanced states of being, if you want to call them that, do communicate themselves much as unadvanced states do.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, what you feel in a gathering of people, heartfelt, singing hymns to the divine, who really mean it, for whom it's alive, and what you feel in a bar, typically are two different things,
Yeah.
unless the people go to the bar and do the singing there. But
Got
you
it.
know, in other words, transmission, or this communicating of our states to one another, that's happening all the time. And even current day science is confirming this with concepts such as the entanglement of even subatomic particles
Right.
being affected by one another and then perpetually linked, even though they drift in different directions.
Yeah.
So if there's any correspondence between the micro reality and the macro, and between what's happening physically and what's happening multidimensionally, it makes sense that we are continuously transmitting our states to everyone else and receiving theirs, and that's happening with all other things and beings. So learning how to manage that toward this kind of greater good is worth doing.
Yeah. Are there any particular people or groups that you work with? Or is it whoever gets called to work with you works with you?
Well, we're not affiliated with any specific sect
Yeah.
or stratum of society. So in that sense, I suppose you could say we're open to those who come. So far, most of those who found their way into our work have been people who, most of them have been aware that they're on some kind of spiritual search,
Yes.
or search for self-development. Most of the people who benefit by our kind of intensive transformational process have one way or another come into a clarity about how existence works. And one of the key pieces of that clarity is a recognition that things in and of themselves don't deliver happiness. Whether they're material things or even spiritual things. So most of the people who are able to benefit from our work, whether they've had a whole lot of altered states of experience, spiritually or otherwise, or not, they're already receptive to or established in an understanding that the having of a special state is not in and of itself going to change them at the core.
Right.
So the people who gravitate into this work and take to it well are people who are ready for a fairly radical transformation at their core. And this transmission tends to activate that very kind of change, more or less spontaneously. In other words, if you or someone were to become attracted to explore this more, what we would, and you might say, well, what's the practice? What's the meditation? You know, what's the disciplines that I need to take on to get myself into this? We're going to say, well, whoa, slow down there a little bit. It's both easier and harder than you think. The easier part is you only need to do some very basic things. Put yourself in proximity to this transmission, which, parenthesis, happily now, can be done online. People all over the world are
Okay.
partaking of this transmission through what we call gazing with my wife Linda and myself or other teachers of our work.
Right.
Through reading the books, through listening to the audio material, through
Mm-hmm.
watching our videos online. So, you know, the transmission process isn't limited to being in the physical location of another person, though it's probably good to get there sometime.
Yes.
But that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is, and both of these are really mutual. So in other words, it's not just receiving an awakened energy and consciousness from someone who's living that, but also sharing where you're coming from with such a person, which can be done over the telephone or Skype.
Right.
I mean, you know,
So, yeah.
technology is really cooperating.
Good.
And another aspect, equally mutual, is listening.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to plug into the teachings that are associated with this particular kind of, one way we describe it is core generated. Literally from the heart of consciousness and life, and I'll say more about that in just a minute. But what it entails, our particular approach, is a pretty comprehensive reframing of how you understand pretty much everything going on in your life.
Right.
So, as an example, people come into this work, they will sooner or later have experiences, moments, epiphanies of more awakened states of consciousness. And then they'll lose that. And they'll come to a teacher, like to me or to Linda or one of the other teachers in our work, and they'll understandably be somewhat bummed out. You know, I had the glimpse, but I couldn't sustain it. And I feel like I lost it. And we'll say to them, well, okay, but the losing of it is necessary. And what in fact is going to be happening now, even if you plunge into your own worst stuff, you know, your own most distressed and weirded out psychological and emotional states, the qualities in yourself that you hate to feel,
yeah,
that's actually progress, not regress. Because what's going on is a holistic inclusion of all of your parts into a new whole being integrity.
Right.
And the awakened condition then is one in which it dawns on you more and more clearly that the truly, I don't want to say ultimate, it's a little big of a word, but the significantly determining, life-determining quality of participation is one in which you gradually learn that, number one, this awakening does take place, sure enough, and you get that you can't lose it even when you're in your most distressed, despairing, horrible states of dreadful low self-esteem and all the rest of it. Well, in most conceptions of spirituality, if you're in that stuff, one thing you're not being right then is spiritual, unless you're working to either fight that quality, fix it, flee it, or in the Facebook age, friend it. You know, I'm going to feel it, but I'm still keeping a distance, I'm still observing it, you know, or I'm saying my mantra, I'm doing this, that, or the other, putting my attention on the guru, remembering the koan, whatever it may be.
Yeah. And
our orientation is one in which all of these states are completely natural. And by virtue of the essentially indomitable mutual activation of this new condition that really does, it very naturally awakens body by body. When the resources are made available and the new way of framing experience is learned, because you're going to tend to keep beating yourself up
Right.
about the dips you take until you get that actually you don't fundamentally prefer to be high anymore.
Right.
Rather, you get that what is most foundational is continuous, no matter how light or dark, high or low your experience may be in any given moment.
Right.
So this process is, it's interesting to be bringing it into the world, because though it bears some similarities with other options of growth that are available,
Right.
There are many ways in which it departs from much of what's out there. And you know, we have great respect for all paths and the stages of the soul's journey that people are on, but we're looking to connect with people who are ready for a track that on one level, like I said, it's both easier and harder. Easier in the sense that it's a fairly direct, I like to say, bio-spiritually natural process.
Bio-spiritually natural.
Bio-spiritually natural. Which means, among other things, that you become as friendly to your own animal nature and all your likes and dislikes, attachments and aversions, reactivity and responsiveness. You know, you stop trying to make the life of Jack or Santa or whoever be fundamentally something other than it is, as if only then will you merit awakeness or happiness or grace or whatever.
Just to sort of re-pitch that, so is that to say that in your experience, finding I won't say awaken, I'll say this whole body and whole being integrity, that doesn't mean that you're not going to sometimes, or you might still have the potential to go down into states where you feel,
yes,
whatever, low self-esteem, victimized.
Authentic whole being integrity,
yes,
takes lots of plunges in what to others might appear to be quite not that.
Right.
But you gradually get, wait a minute, those definitions of integrity no longer apply.
Yeah.
Because what is integrity? From the word integer.
Right.
It's a singularity.
Yeah.
So what you're doing is you're uniting all of your apparently mutually exclusive parts into a greater uniting and holding singularity. The more you do that, the more energy, attention, and awareness you free up from frozen out, numbed off, bad me states, the more you also then are able to hold and open to the greater multidimensional integrity of what is, after all, I'll say our true nature, meaning our natural birthright and potential.
Right.
It's not true until it's real.
Yeah. And could you say a bit more about, obviously, waking down in mutuality? You touched on the sort of democratization. Is there anything more that you'd like to say about the sort of the mutuality part of the work that you do?
Yeah, well, those three words, waking down in mutuality, are the best known designation for our general work to date, and probably will continue to be. And the waking aspect is essentially about tapping into, uncovering, or bringing forward this greater consciousness or feeling of being that is simultaneously at one with everything, while also not thereby having to renounce the local ordinary self, or outgrow it or transcend it perfectly. The down aspect includes both, as we were implying earlier, both profound descent into and inclusion of, integration of what's often called the shadow aspects of the psyche, as well as, and really as part of, an embodiment of that total consciousness that, you see, it includes ego along with, you could say it includes ego self along with God self or greater self.
Right.
And doesn't really have a fundamental preference of the one over the other, as if, you know, the ego's kind of okay until you get over it. It's much more nuanced than that.
Mm-hmm.
So then the mutuality piece is, for us, it's been a tremendous discovery of how much power there is in living this kind of process out together.
Right.
On, say, one end of the spectrum, a group of people get together and someone is feeling pretty disturbed. They're going through some really difficult stuff. And it's even things about themselves that maybe they've never shared.
Right.
Or it's been very difficult to. They've often been judged about it. And they bring this into the room and they're feeling all perturbed about it and feeling like they might be told, well, you got to leave. Sorry, you can't be that here. And instead, the other people there are saying things like, thank you for speaking that part of me as well.
Right.
This gives me more room to be here too. So it's a synergistic liberation of energy, attention, awareness that have tended to be locked up, frozen off, numbed out in each of us. At the other end of the spectrum, if you want to use that kind of picturing, is that in this gazing that we do, and in the interacting that we have, there's more and more of a welcoming in of the parts of us that are even more tender, shy, and vulnerable than our most broken, distressed, despairing qualities or zones of identity. And those more tender, shy, and vulnerable parts happen to be our greater nature, our you could say our future. One of the phrases Linda and our kind of a axiom, I guess, I don't know what you call it. Your future, struggling to be born into your present, can look and sound and feel exactly like your past automatically intruding into your present.
Huh.
In other words, your bright self, or the golden shadow they sometimes call it, of who you have not yet fully become, is also part of what is being served in this process. So mutuality brings these qualities out with one another. And we're primates. We're very, very social creatures, which is significant. See, we're taking the animal nature seriously. I mean, we might, Linda and I both, particularly me, I identify strongly with tigers. They're my Siberian tiger is my main totem animal.
Right.
So there's a lot of cat energy that we both happen to be able to appreciate.
Yeah.
But biologically, we're primates.
Yeah.
And primates, I mean, I don't know enough biology to say this definitively, but primates are definitely among the most social types of critters running around the planet.
Right.
So the kind of spirituality that has sifted people off into the monad of the self, inadvertently or perhaps intentionally, does a kind of violence to something very fundamental in our nature.
Yeah.
That living this kind of process out in mutuality begins to heal and correct.
Yeah.
So mutuality is a very, very powerful synergizer of the other aspects of the process. And it is itself also revelation, because more and more you begin to realize that the ultimate state, or the ultimate potential states, let's assume there are many and it goes on and on, but their greatest expression, realization and expression, is not inside the individual, so to speak. It's not merely subjective as the autonomous individual's experience, but they are mutually subjective. So a couple of the other teachers in our work came up with the phrase mutual oneness, or mutual oneness, to get at
yes.
the shared quality of participation, the intersubjectivity.
So what does that leave you thinking about the sort of the spiritual path of the hermit, or the person that goes off and has a very sort of solitary existence? Do you feel like that just is the path for some people, or do you?
Well, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a very important question. One of the ways that we try to make sense of where we're all coming from is we talk about a spirit-matter split.
Yeah, right.
And we have some other language for it that's maybe a little more technical, but that's a good way of describing what appears to have been an evolutionary development.
Mm-hmm.
So the fall,
yes.
the sense that humanity used to be more primally connected and then fell from that grace is a kind of archetypal way of languaging what, if we look at the anthropological and paleontological record, I don't know if paleontology is exactly the right word here, but certainly if we examine human prehistory as best we can, and pre-human history,
yes.
There appears to have been a relative unconsciousness that we have moved out of into greater and greater degrees of consciousness. Not absolutely meaning that every society today is more advanced than ancient Greece, but in the general stream,
yes.
there has been a growth in awareness, and in some ways especially self-awareness,
yes.
within each individual. I don't want to say especially, but it's one of the ways that we have changed. We've become less like a tribe of monkeys,
yes.
and more like collections of autonomous individuals. That autonomous individuality is a quality of self-awareness that seems to have been developed in the midst of our awareness of reality changing, where the sense of the individuated consciousness or feeling of me has become more and more self-aware and foundational to the lives and expressions of great numbers of people, rather than being so much part of a family or a tribe or an ethnic culture,
yes.
that significantly individuals don't really count.
Yes.
There might be the tribal leaders, but everybody's main sense of identity is I'm part of the group.
Yes.
So underneath that change has been also a growth. It's not a bad thing, but out of a more primordial unconsciousness, in which the world was a great unity and people participated, but without that kind of self-awareness that's so prevalent today, there emerged in effect, a splitting of the world, where people began to develop an awareness that there are these two great dimensions. Loosely, we could call one spirit and the other matter.
Yes.
And a chasm has developed between the spiritual and material natures that it doesn't go throughout all cultures. The more indigenous cultures don't appear to have such a split, for instance. They see the world as one, they're more in touch with nature.
Mm.
But what they don't have, for the most part, is the highly developed self-awareness that came through spiritually in the East and more, you could say, scientifically, intellectually in the relatively recent West.
Yes.
So this split is now being healed in the leading edge of the human species experiment.
Yeah.
And we're one of the laboratories
Right.
in which that healing is being addressed.
Yeah.
And so in effect then we're an expression of something that's much bigger and more pervasive than just our little group, several hundred people or several thousand, however many it is at any given moment. It's,
Yeah.
it's not the whole race, human race by any stretch. But there does appear to be, or there do appear to be many other groups who are working on pieces of this as well. And it seems to me, and to my partners in our work, that our particular contribution is likely to have importance for a lot of people over time.
Right.
Because the spiritual paths, the great spiritual paths of the past, have been to some degree or another predicated on this split. So if you listen close, I mean, some of them obviously say stuff like the material world is hell, only God is above in heaven, or in some other dimension of reality, you've got to take your attention out of this world and raise it up and get liberated from here and never come back.
Yes.
And whether it's upward or into some dimension that's non-directional, there has been in spirituality the positing of some kind of salvation or liberation that relieves us of the, in some ways there's an assumption of inherent sinfulness just by being here.
Yeah.
You know, got a body.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, too bad. Thank you, well said. So the other side of the coin is the more scientific intellectual orientation that's especially become prodigiously developed in the West through the Renaissance and various stages of the Enlightenment and so forth. That essentially, a la Sir Francis Bacon, let's put nature to the rack and torture her secrets out of her. There's been a recognition that we no longer need to be at the mercy of this world with all its capricious, deadly and horrifying potential. And the new emergent kind of unity, this new whole being integrity, that you see is also a relational integrity as well as an autonomous integrity. It's whole reality integrity. This is an advance. This is not going to throw away the tremendous developments that we've received. But it does take note of ways in which those developments and their philosophies are still assuming a fundamental distinction in reality between spirit and matter, or God and the flesh, or mind and nature, etc.
Right.
So it seems to us it bodes pretty well.
Yes.
For people, and part of what we're doing is looking to find those for whom this is an attractive option at this time.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems that way to me.
And you mentioned sort of the great spiritual traditions. I just I wondered what your sense of whether were Jesus and Buddha, were they on about the same thing in your experience?
Actually, no. From my perspective, I think Ken Wilber might have said, seems like I saw him quoted as saying, the Buddha couldn't have done what we're doing today. Not because he wasn't a great being,
yes,
but because their generation, this
yes.
is back at really the formational times of this split becoming prevalent.
Yes.
When human beings began to have conceptions such as liberation from the wheel of birth and death. I mean, talk to earlier cultures for hundreds of thousands of years and they say, what?
Yeah.
Or they might say, well, we get liberated, we go from this world into the heavenly dimension,
yeah,
following the ancestors. But there's no such thing as a radical release from all incarnational possibilities.
yes,
Not only gross, but also subtle. So much of those earlier teachings...
Could you just say what you mean by not only gross, but also subtle?
Well, in other words, going into a heavenly world,
right,
following the ancestors. In the Native American phrase, which I think might be a white movie maker's phrase, so I'll hedge on it a little bit, but the happy hunting ground.
right, yeah.
Which essentially is a version of this world that's of a subtler energetic nature, but is largely the same kind of place.
Yes.
And so at some point, the ancient adepts figured out that's not true liberation.
Right.
And in the East, a bunch of them came to the conclusion that that's just a way station before you come right back here and do all this over again. So whatever true liberation is, it's got to be completely released from all such possibilities. And thus the great concepts of liberation that came through, especially the Eastern teachings about nirvana.
Yes.
The quenching of all desire, and therefore all residual cravings that would tend to produce next births and going along on the wheel.
Yeah.
Does this make sense?
Yeah. No.
So
does that relate to the gross realm that you're talking about?
well, the gross and also the subtle.
Right.
Because some of them figured out just getting into the subtle realms and having a comparatively godlike existence, perhaps compared to what it's like here, you eventually exhaust the merit of those good karmas, and they reach the conclusion that people then would come back into earthly incarnation.
Got it.
This framing that's coming forth now really starts right at square one and says, whoa, 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 wait a minute. How can you be so sure that material existence is less fundamentally divine, real, and important than the more spiritual, subtle and spiritual aspects? And it appears to many of us that that's the next phase here. If you look at the history of spirituality, there seems to be a great healing of that split. That's underway. And philosophically, it then certainly can begin to take issue with many of the assumptions underneath the earlier philosophies and practices.
Yes.
And not only the earlier ones, but also the modern ones that are unwittingly or consciously built on those.
Yes.
Now, there are plenty of things about all these that are great contributions, just as the sciences that have produced so many developments. We're not going to go back from that. We're not going to return to some primordial pre-existing state. And we're going to continue to build on what we've been given, but I have a hunch that more and more of us are going to gravitate into what I feel, and others, a good number of others are feeling similarly, is a more biospiritually natural condition of existence. That in many ways we would contend is as awakened as these great states that have been described, coming from other traditions from the past.
Yes.
But it's more integrated. And so the development of a human being over a lifetime can take a different trajectory than the old style teachings have anticipated.
Right.
So that's getting into a lot of detail. It's, you know, there's a whole lot more to that story. Let's put it that way.
Well, we'll look forward to that. So is that to say, so obviously I asked you about Jesus and Buddha, is that to say that the people who are kind of working on the leading edge of the kind of work that you're describing, if you like, may surpass the development or awareness or consciousness of where Buddha
Perfect
was?
question. See, or
is that
because the developmental sequence is different.
Yes.
I wouldn't. Would you grab that?
No, I think I was.
I wouldn't presume any such thing as surpassing. And that's true also of great yogis, mystics, saints, sages, avatars who have lived recently and are living today. This kind of awakening doesn't require the profound healing and refinement of body, mind, and emotions as a preliminary to awakening that so many of the traditional paths have. So people who come into it can look pretty grossly ordinary and feel that way. I mean, a lot of what we work with people who've recently awakened in our process, which is more or less routine. Most people do. If they're hungry for it, they stick around, and most people who stick around go through this shift, we call it the second birth,
right,
within a few months to a few years. A very short time compared to supposedly lifetimes. Only a few in any generation will ever get it.
Yes.
So it really works. But the body-mind persona of such an awakened person is still relatively raw rather than cooked, to use some anthropological language.
Right. Could you just say a little bit about the second birth?
Yeah,
and how one knows whether one's sort of experienced that?
Yeah, but just to finish the other point. So the great the great realizations of the Buddha or Jesus, and as one of my teachers, Adi Da, used to say about both of them. He said, unfortunately, we don't have a Polaroid.
A Polaroid camera.
Yeah, in other words, we don't have a snapshot. We don't have a reliable record of what these individuals actually did say and do.
Yes.
We have these piecemeal records that have essentially come down in written form and legend, and we don't have an incorruptible, definitive documentation. But they appear to have been great advanced beings in their day, and in our process, as a way of segueing into your next question there, I began to speak of this awakening as a second birth after it had taken place in me, because the two great masters who had meant the most to me,
Yeah.
one of them the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi, the other American-born, he took the